Okay, so we're going to go on to our second way of graphing by finding 2 points. And this time we're going to be looking specifically at graphing by finding the x and y intercept of a line. So before we start that, I want to go ahead and define for you the y-intercept and the x-intercept, and then we'll do a couple of examples. So the y-intercept is defined as the point where a line crosses the y-axis. And if you'll remember from our previous video, our previous section, this line going up and down here, this vertical line, that's your y-axis. So we're looking at where a line crosses along this axis right here. So what I want to do is just draw a couple of lines for you, and we're going to look and find out what those points are. So I'm just going to randomly draw a line. Okay, and what I want to look at is I want to talk about the value of that point right there. So if you look at that, remember when we were trying to find the x and y coordinates of a point, we start at the origin. Well, you notice that I don't need to move left or right to be in line with that point. So my x value here is going to be 0, and then we're moving down 1, 2, 3, so my y value would be -3. So the y-intercept for this line is 0, -3. Let's draw another one and see what happens with that y-intercept. So I'm going to draw a line here. Again, I'm just drawing a random line. Just want to look and see what happens when that line crosses the y-axis. So that would be about right here. Again, crossing the y-axis, which is our vertical axis. Again, starting from the origin, we wouldn't need to move left or right in order to be in line with that point. So our x value is going to be 0. And then we would move up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So our y value would be 5. Let's do one more. I hope when you're watching this, you're seeing a pattern start to emerge with these lines. So for this pink line here, again, just a random line. Here's that point. Again, I wouldn't go right or left. I would just stay here because I'm already lined up with my point. So my x value is 0. And I would go up 1, so that would give me 1. So the y-intercept for this one is 0, 1. And if you'll notice, for each one of these lines, when I look at the y-intercept, my y value, or excuse me, my x value is 0. And that's consistent. Every time we talk about the y-axis or the y-intercept, our x value is always 0. So our point is going to be 0, comma, something for our y-intercept. Okay. So let's talk about the x-intercept and see if it's very similar to the y-intercept. So I'm going to scoot this up here. And the x-intercept is the point where the line crosses the x-axis. And again, if you'll remember from our earlier section, that this line across here, this horizontal line, that is our x-axis. So we're looking at where our line crosses that axis right there. So again, I'm just going to draw a random line here. Okay, just because I want to look at where does that line cross this x-axis. That would be that point right there. So again, starting from my origin, to find the coordinates of this point, I would go to the right 2, so that makes my x value 2. But since I don't need to move up or down to get to that point, my y value is going to be 0. So the x-intercept of this line is 2, 0. So let's look at one more. And say I have a line right here. Again, just drawing a random line so I can see where it's crossing at my x. So in this particular instance, again, we're looking at this point right here. If I start at my origin, I would have to move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like 6 to my left, which would give us -6. And again, I wouldn't need to move up or down from that point. It would just be that -6, so that would be a 0. So very similar to our y-intercept, I hope you're noticing that in this case, our y value is 0 for our x-intercept, and that's always true for our x-intercept. The y value is always 0, and we have a point where we have something comma 0. Okay, and these are going to be two very important concepts when we go to finding the x and y intercept. Plugging in a 0 for your y when we're talking about the x-intercept, and then plugging in a 0 for your x when we're talking about the y-intercept. So let's do an example. Okay, so for our first example, again, we want to find the y-intercept and the x-intercept specifically, and our equation is 3x plus 7y equals 21. And I'm still going to make my chart like I did in the previous type of problems where we were finding any 2 points. I just don't get to pick this time, okay? I want specifically to find the y-intercept, and I want to specifically find the x-intercept. So again, if you remember from what we just talked about, when I look at the y-intercept, I know that x is 0. So I'm going to put a 0 here for my x, and I'm going to figure out what my y value is from plugging that into my equation. And then the same thing is true for the x-intercept. I know y is 0, so I'm going to put a 0 here for my y, and I'm going to plug that in and try to figure out what my x value is. Okay, so if we start with our first point here, we're putting 0 in for our x. We're going to do 3 times 0 plus 7y equals 21. Well, just like we talked about earlier when we used 0, 3 times 0 is 0. So it's not adding or subtracting anything to my problem. I can just cancel it out. And now I have 7y equals 21. So to finish solving for y, I would need to divide by 7. And y would equal 3. So for our y-intercept, we have x is equal to 0. Again, always equal to 0 for our y-intercept. And our x value, or excuse me, our y value was 3. We're going to do the exact same thing for our second point, except this time, since our 0 is in our y column, we're going to plug that in for our y and solve for x. So we're going to do 3x plus 7 times 0 equals 21. Again, 7 times 0, that's just 0, so we can cross that out. And we have 3x equals 21. And then we're going to divide both sides by 3, again solving for x and getting x by itself. And we end up that x is equal to 7. So for our second point, or our x-intercept, we have x equal to 7, while y is 0. Now, be very, very cautious when you're doing your homework on the computer. Notice that it specifically asks you to list the y-intercept and the x-intercept. That's one of the reasons why I did it above. I put my 0 for my x first, just to make sure that when I put my answer into the system, I put it in correct order. So this would be 0 and 3. And then my second point, my x-intercept, would be 7 and 0. So now I need to graph those 2 points and draw my line. So remember, your y-intercept should go on your y-axis. That's this vertical axis right here. So from that, we're going to take, and we're not going to go left or right, but we're going to go up 3. There's our y-intercept. And then the same thing for our 7, 0. This time we're going to go to the right 7. We're going to stay at 0. And all we've got to do to draw our line is take our ruler and connect our dots, again making sure to go across our entire graph. And there's the line, 3x plus 7y equal to 21, graphing by finding our x and y intercepts. Okay, so for our last example, again, we're still finding the y-intercept and the x-intercept. So we know, again, here for the y-intercept, x is equal to 0. And we know for the x-intercept that y is equal to 0. So we're going to draw our chart. Again, with our x and our y, we know we're going to plug in a 0 for x. We're going to figure out what our y value is. We're going to plug a 0 in for our y and figure out what the corresponding x value is. Okay, it's really important to remember that whenever we're talking about the y-intercept, our x value is 0, and then for the x-intercept, the y value is 0. So when we plug this in, we're going to do 7 times 0 plus 8y equals 3. Again, 7 times 0 is 0, so we can just cross that out, and we're left with 8y equals 3. We're going to divide both sides by 8, and we get y equals 3 over 8. Now, for us, when we're putting our answer into the system, we're going to go ahead and leave it as a fraction. Now, I'm going to have to graph this here in just a second, and I'm going to tell you that 3/8 is just a little bit above 1, so that will help us graph that particular point. So now we're going to do the same thing with our y value. We're going to plug in 0 for y and see what happens to our x. So we have 7x plus 8 times 0 is equal to 3. Again, this guy goes away because he's 8 times 0, and that's 0. So we have 7x equals 3. We're going to divide both sides by 7. Again, we're going to go ahead and keep this as the fraction when we enter our answer in. And again, we're at that point where we're just a little bit above, or excuse, a little bit above 0. We're not quite even halfway to 1. So down here, when we put our answer in, again, remember to make sure you're looking at which one it wants you to put first. It is always going to list the y-intercept first, and that was the point 0 and 3/8. And then the other point we had was 3/7 and 0. And this is going to be a little bit rough to graph just because we're looking at some pretty small fractions here. But 3/8 would maybe be about right there on our our y-axis, and then 3/7 would be just about right there on our x-axis. Again, pretty close to 0. They're pretty small fractions. And we're going to connect those dots. And there is our line. Now when you're doing your homework on the system, it will graph those points automatically for you, so don't worry too much about the fractions. Just know how to solve those x and y intercepts.